Okay. Welcome to sig-testing meeting. I think I recognize everybody here, having been here before, so we don't need to do intro. But if you do want to go ahead and introduce yourself, feel free to speak up. Otherwise, yeah, I think we have a single item on the agenda, so if you want to start off, go ahead.
Cool. Yeah, thank you. Um, so I guess, yeah, I mean, I've been here like once or twice before, but yeah, I'm Mike. I work for Red Hat. You might see me as Elmiko online. I'm a chair and tech lead for Sig Cloud provider. I also do a lot of work with Cluster Autoscaler and Cluster API and Carpenter and stuff like that. So that kind of brings me to my point here, which is that I've been looking at kubetest too. And one of the things that motivated this is that in the SIG cloud provider, we've been talking about building generic cloud provider tests that we could run on top of any cloud provider. And so that then begs the question, could we make it easier to run like the Kubernetes tests on could we make it easier to spawn clusters on any platform, right? That we might have donated to the CNCF or we might have credits on them or whatever. Um, since I work closely with the Cluster API project, I thought Cluster API was a really great target for this. And just as a way of explanation for folks who maybe aren't familiar with it, Cluster API is a Kubernetes subproject to make a declarative API for declaring like machine infrastructure, right? Node infrastructure, basically. And it is abstracted across, I think, over 2 dozen platforms at this point. So my thinking was if I could write a deployer that spoke to the language of Cluster API, it would become very easy to kind of remix this on any platform because the higher level objects are generic and then the lower level objects talk to the specific platform like AWS or OpenStack or whatever. And so I started writing this, and I've been looking through the infrastructure and the way that kubetest 2 works. And one of the first challenges I'm running into is the notion of building a Kubernetes image or building the Kubernetes binaries and then putting them into a node that is going to be coming up in the new cluster so that we know we're running a cluster that's basically against that. Um, and I've been looking at the kubetest 2 kind deployer and the GCE, GKE deployers to see how they do this. But I just wanted to kind of confirm or maybe get some advice here. Like when kubetest 2 runs, it's running on an environment that builds like a tarball there. And then that tarball needs to be, like in the case of kind, it's just kind of copied into the container. But in the case of like GCE or GKE, it's like a tarball that goes into some sort of cloud storage that then gets utilized on the node when it comes up. Does that sound does that sound like a pattern that, that I should be following or trying to repeat, or maybe there's a better pattern I should be using? Yeah, and because ultimately what I need to do is build the binaries, and I'm going to need to, when Cluster API starts to make nodes, I'll have to like inject the binaries during the node bring up process so that I can, copy in like the new kubelet and stuff like that. So I'm curious if like maybe anybody has like comments about that or suggestions or.
We might unfortunately be lacking cube test expertise among folks here.
Okay.
Um, I think I'm trying to think of who like is more involved besides obvious of like other sig testing leads, but yeah, I think these are good questions and like I do recognize what's like being asked, but I also don't know enough to like have good answers here, at least for myself.
Yeah, no, I mean that's totally acceptable. Like, yeah, that's the way these things kind of work out. I'll probably keep pushing along following the GK. Like just to talk through what I'm looking at right now, like, Cluster API, the way it works is you define like several different object types, and one of the object types defines like for a specific cloud provider, how do you create the instance? And then there's like it uses kubeadm to turn that instance into a kubelet, right? Or into a Kubernetes node. And it does that by using, in most cases, using the cloud init output of kubeadm to stuff that into the cloud init that goes into whatever cloud you're on, right? And what I'm probably going to do is there's a way that like you can inject commands after kubeadm is gone. So I'm going to kind of follow some of the other things where I'll build the binaries, I'll try to put them into like a neutral place where they can be pulled from the cloud. And then when the cloud instance comes up as part of its cloud init startup, it'll pull these binaries and overwrite, kind of the defaults or get it ready to be like a Kubernetes node. So that's kind of what I'm thinking um, on that level, at least. I guess the next question I had is kind of more about what um, what would be acceptable to the SIG, right? Because part of the notion I'm writing this provider or this deployer around is that cluster API, the way it prefers to be run is in like a hub spoke topology where you have what's known as a management cluster that's the hub. And you can create what are called cluster objects. And then that hub will spawn a new cluster for you and deliver you like a kube config for that cluster. So I'm kind of wondering from an infrastructure perspective, how does this idea strike the SIG that like, what if we propose some idea that we would have a build cluster that's like the central kind of management cluster, and then like, tests get spawned off as clusters that get created. And I know this probably sounds familiar to Peter because this is kind of the way we do it inside Red Hat. So I'm kind of curious, does that notion comport well with the Kubernetes community infrastructure, or would this be like a really big change? Would adding cluster API be like too much kind of mental load for the people who maintain these systems? Or like I'm just kind of curious to feel it out and see what the SIG thinks about it.
So you said this would be a new build cluster for this?
Right, like it would be a different topology for the way that like I don't I guess this is partially my ignorance about the way that the kube infrastructure is currently set up. But yeah, like the notion would be that in with this kube test deployer, you would need to have a cluster API management cluster running, right? And that cluster would be responsible then for making the workload clusters where the actual tests would run. But the deployer will talk to that management cluster. So every time you run kube test 2, you would give it like a kube config and some configuration, and it would hit that management cluster and then spawn a workload cluster, return the kube config back to kube test 2, and then kube test 2 would pass that on to the actual testing part where it would run the test against the actual workload cluster. But I'm guessing this would represent maybe a change in the way that our testing infrastructure is currently set up. So I'm trying to feel out like how does it work currently, and is this the kind of change that would be acceptable or would even be approachable? Like, because I don't want to start doing all this work and then the SIG is like, no, we don't want to put cluster API in the middle of our operations. So like I'm trying to feel out like, is this something the SIG would investigate, or does it sound interesting at all, or am I barking up the wrong tree, or what?
Yeah, offhand, I'm not like sure. But I think the primary questions around there would be basically like um probably similar for anything around SIG ownership. It's just like is SIG testing like correct for it? In which case like I think probably SIG testing and or K10 sound reasonable here. Um and then what's the expected like is this general enough that it makes sense for like testing for the Kubernetes project? Fair. And is there expected ongoing maintenance or like other expertise involved?
Right,
I think that's the one where like I'm not 100% sure if it's expected like okay, we just need this implemented once. It represents a change to like how some things are run, but like it might even be analogous to like how some things are done with Boscos or whatnot right now. Or we just have something already working like this, so it's not necessarily a change.
right.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, and that's I think like the questions you're bringing up, Michelle, are absolutely right on. And this is really what I want to, what I want to interact with the SIG about is, like if and obviously I'm not proposing to make these changes and then run away or whatever. Hey, Brady. But yeah, like if we were to add cluster API into the mix for how our testing topologies are created, and maybe that's part of infra or whatever. Yeah, it would bring new maintenance challenges, right? Because we would have to update the cluster API, when it releases new releases, and it would add a new sort of load in terms of people would have to understand how to debug a cluster API failure and those kind of things. And that's really why I want to ask about it before going too deep, because it's like, okay, this deployer could be useful regardless, right? We might use it in the cluster API community or something, but it might not be useful to the core of Kubernetes. And I'm trying to kind of understand, like, would it be useful? Would it even be acceptable? Because yeah, it brings more mental load, and I'm not sure that, given how light we are staffed in the testing and infrastructure realm, like I don't want to add more load on top of that, right?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the point. Basically, is like some things might make sense, but also like practically, just given the number of people we have supporting various things, like it might be. I think it would really depend on like what the ongoing maintenance is expected to be for that kind of thing. And then in that case, like that also makes owning SIG more important. Where it's like if it is expected to be handed off to SIG testing, for instance, for like either further ownership or maintenance, that might be like higher standards than if it's expected to live under something else and then be used.
Right.
I'm
Absolutely.
also, yeah, talking pretty vaguely here.
Well, right. And like, and I'm, part of the reason to do this is kind of for a long-term plan, right? Because
Right.
I could envision a future, right, where Kubernetes is relying much more heavily on the cluster API infrastructure to run its tests, because in the future, it might look simpler for like the infra team could say, well, we can maintain this management cluster that can create Kubernetes clusters on different infrastructures, right? Like AWS, GCP, OpenStack, whatever. And hopefully that's integrating with our upstream kind of CNCF credits program where we have partners who are coming to the CNCF. They're donating their infrastructure credits so that and I don't even remember if we're using credits anymore or not, but I'll just kind of use that as a placeholder for now. We're taking the credits, and then our infra teams are able to like build these management clusters that can use the credits against those infrastructures. And now, upstream from that or downstream from that, the people who want to run tests have all these options for where they can run the test now. And they could say, spawn me an AWS cluster to run this test, spawn me a GCP, spawn me an OpenStack. And I think if we can reach that point, years in the future from now, then we could do more testing on the regressions around things like cloud controller managers and cloud storage infrastructure and even like cluster auto scaling and whatnot. So I'm trying to look at like, would there be any interest, or would there be any excitement around trying to build kind of a different infrastructure for this so that we could test things in a different way? And that, yeah, it's a big task, and maybe I should generate some more documentation to kind of like explain what exactly I'm talking about. But I figured I was working on it last week. I'll come talk now since there's another meeting. We could start to get into kind of discussing it or whatever.
Yeah, sorry. Absolutely. Um, Also, other folks, please feel free to speak up. I truly am not very experienced on cube tests or like some of the stuff at all. I was just gonna say, like, I think if you have further details that are like proposed, like not a full cap necessarily or anything, but just like a little bit more on the details of like, hey, here's like the exact stuff, whatever's exists on like existing similar or analogous things, or like the current process, I guess, that this would be like instead of replacing or helping with. I think that would be great, and I think that might also be easier for offline discussion as well, to just like snag the folks who know more about this, um, and then get their feedback on it.
Okay, yeah, like I'll definitely work towards documenting this and trying to like, come up with a way to explain it to people. And at the very least, I should be at, barring any sort of travel snafus, I should be at KubeCon next month. So hopefully I could like kind of, hopefully I'll see some of y'all there, and maybe just talk and like more less formally about this and just kind of see what people are thinking and whatnot. But yeah, I'll try to get it documented in a way that we could share it out a little more and everything, and just yeah, maybe get a wider opinion here, because I feel like that's where I'm at this point. Is I'm starting to do this, and I can see how I could run it locally and everything, and maybe I could get it working locally. But then the question is, how does this even work inside of the CI like testing infrastructure? Like, what does that even look like? I just realized like I don't really know.
Yeah. I guess I'm also curious for like I don't know, but opinions on folks being like, how much is this a priority? Like, how much of a need is it for us to have something like this?
Yeah,
Because like,
that's a great question. And I think it's kind of a philosophical question too, right? So, over the last like 7 or 8 years, right, we had this massive effort in SIG Cloud Provider to remove all the cloud provider specific code that we own from Kubernetes core, right? I think
right.
that, we saw the storage folks do this as well. Like we don't want to have all this all this cloud specific code there. But now we've created a situation where in the end-to-end tests, we still have some very specific cloud code that is around like generating instances and removing instances, testing those kind of interactions, right? And we have a whole series of cloud controllers that our SIG owns, but we're only able to test like one of them, right? One of them that's used in production. There's like the kind one, but that's not used in production, right? So like the only one we really test heavily is the GCP one. Now there is also we do test AWS and Azure, but we test them more lightly because their integrations aren't as deep in the testing package, right? So one of the things that I've been looking at with some colleagues is can we make the tests more generic so that they could apply to any cloud controller? And then can we pull those cloud specific details out of the core of Kubernetes so that we could like allow that code not to be there and to be closer to the places where it's used in the cloud providers, right? So as part of this, in the SIG, we've come up with a lot of different ways to talk about like how we want to do this, right? And like the some of my colleagues from Google, they're directly working on the GKE kubetest stuff and everything because it's already there. We can already do these things there. But if we want to be able to enable full AWS testing or full Azure testing, we need a way to make those clusters in a more like automated fashion. And then we get to kind of the question that I want to ask, which is, okay, since the SIG owns all these things and we want to do like regression testing on them, shouldn't we be building an infrastructure that allows us to accurately test these pieces of code? And if the answer is yes, then it's like we have to test them on the clouds they come from. We can't test them in isolation, not without spending a lot on building mocks and those kind of things, right? So yeah, this is kind of like I think in some ways it's kind of an existential question to the Kubernetes community, which is like how much do we want to test the code that we are signing, kind of responsibility for? And if the answer is we want to test as much as possible, then we have to start thinking about ways to evolve our testing framework to allow for this dynamic selection of infrastructures, basically. And that's kind of what I'm trying to prompt the discussion around, I guess, or what I'm leading the discussion around.
Yeah, I think this might be a good time to dig up some of the like I don't remember where the discussion was last time around like when the cloud provider code was being removed, but I feel like that would be good to dig up and just see what our previous stance was on that as well. And or I mean broadly, like folks involved in the discussion, because I know there was a lot of discussion around it.
Yeah, that's a
Um,
good suggestion.
because I think the need that you're speaking to makes a lot of sense. But it would be good to make sure we're not accidentally like getting into the same problem that we had for removing the cloud provider code in the first place. It's
Right.
like it's not doing the same thing, but if they're like depending on exactly what we were trying to avoid, definitely don't want to be like redoing some of that work that will need to be like refactored again.
No, you're absolutely right. And this is something I've been thinking about is like, so with regards to like the testing side of this, right? We're trying to move all that cloud specific stuff into the actual cloud provider repos, right? So we have like cloud provider AWS, cloud provider
Right.
Azure. That's where the cloud controllers come from. We're trying to move that stuff there so that it's actually next to the things that are testing it and not in KK, right? And then
Yeah.
as we're building these new tests, the tests are generic and they kind of live in KK, but then each of the individual cloud providers can like build against it and then run using their own repository as the source of truth, right? And they might have supplemental tests as well. And so ultimately, what I would love to get to a point to is where I could say, I'm going to set up automated tests from this repo that are going to use the kube test 2 structure to build me a kube at whatever version, right? And then I can put them together and test it the way it is. And I can have the test results show up here where I expected to see like a regression or something, right? And then ultimately we can have those feed back into some test grid or whatever so that we could see when individual providers start to regress or
Right.
start to have failures or something. But yeah, like what I want to do is I want to pull this stuff even further from KK. And I think if we look at the cluster API project, it gives us a methodology for making some generic parts that could be shared by everyone, and then leaving the cloud specific parts kind of as a detail that comes with the cloud provider. And I think that starts to focus us more on like, we're looking at the generic, what is a Kubernetes cluster? It's a couple control plane machines and a couple workload machines versus, oh, it's an AWS MX6 large and an AWS MS6 whatever, like, so we take those details and put them closer to where they're actually needed. And that's my hope, at least.
Yeah. Now again, I think that makes a lot of sense. So I think more detailed like proposal for sharing and making sure that we get feedback from the right folks makes a lot of sense. And hopefully it's not going to be like pursuing too much work too early for you to do so.
Well, right. And that's why I'm asking these questions. Because yeah,
Yeah.
if it turns out that everyone's like, no, we just don't have, there's just not enough people, there's never gonna be enough people, or there's not enough interest to support this kind of infrastructure, then yeah, like I'll take my foot off the gas pedal and kind of like, we'll think about it a different way or something.
Yeah. Um, no, I think it's worth talking about at least. I just regret that I do not have like enough knowledge around here to give like a better answer.
Now,
Like,
fair enough. There's like
uh,
so many layers to all this stuff. It's like it's difficult to know them all, right?
yeah. Okay, I was repeating myself. I think just making sure that like this is condensed into something short and also that we specifically catch a few of the other sig testing leads is a great idea because I think that will be good enough for like the quick feedback on is this plausible? What other things need to be clarified or just like uh yeah, no, we can't do this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that would be good to know. Yeah, like especially if people are just like, no, this sounds like something that's way too big for us ever to get into.
Yeah. And I think quick feedback from a couple of the like other leads would also be reasonable before like if this is a new proposal, this would also be reasonable, I think, to send out to the mail list, but it will probably be faster to just like make sure that a couple folks see it and have like just their quick opinions.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. Like, I'm not at enhancement point or that kind of thing yet because
Definitely not.
there are still some technical questions I need to answer from the cluster API side to see if I can like really make this work the way I want it to. But yeah, like I'm asking these other questions just to kind of start opening the discussion, I guess.
Yeah. Honestly, I think that these notes might be enough to just like point put folks to it and then just ask like, yeah, hey, experts.
Yeah, cool. like I said, I'll put together a little document to explain myself a little bit better and maybe put some diagrams in there to show like what kind of topologies I'm talking about. But yeah, appreciate the conversation. And Brady, thank you for taking over with the notes there.
Yeah, thank you. Well, okay. Is there anybody else that wants to comment on this topic? And I guess I'll also put out, is there anybody that has a another topic to add to the agenda? Otherwise, I think with that, we'd be closing out. Seeing some nods. Cool. All right. Thanks, folks. Thanks, Mike, for presenting about that. And then otherwise, I will see y'all around. And hopefully with some more discussion on the Slack and whatnot in between next meeting.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate everybody's attention. Brady, did you have something you wanted to say or you just waving? All right, cool.
Thanks,
Awesome.
everyone. Bye.
All right, cool.
See ya.
Later, guys.
Thanks. Bye.